The most intense and memorable night of my life was that Friday. I experienced an unusual sensation of calm because the place was so quiet and serene. After a long week, I was worn out and just wanted to go to sleep. I believed that nothing could break the silence of the night when I lay down. After my divorce, I had been a single mother for 8 years. I didn't have a negative relationship with my ex-husband. We simply drifted apart. It was the most satisfying and difficult thing I had ever done to raise my kid Mason by myself. Being both his mother and father was challenging, but he was everything to me: intelligent, humorous, and compassionate. I hardly had the energy to put on my pajamas before going to bed that night since I was so exhausted. There was silence in the house. Mason had finished his homework and played video games before going to bed hours earlier. I finally had some alone time in my room. The moonlight, shining through the thin drapes, created soft shadows on the walls. I relaxed beneath the blanket, savoring the warmth and allowing my thoughts to wander. It had been a pleasant change to have a quiet life lately. After a challenging year, Mason and I had created a positive life together, despite going through a lot together after his father departed. We remained close, even though Mason was over 20. He was always a kind and considerate individual. I occasionally feared that, for someone his age, he assumed too much responsibility. When I thought about him, I grinned. I felt fortunate to have him in my life because he was so kind, but I was too exhausted to think about it tonight. After feeling drowsy and heavy, I heard a gentle knock on the door of my bedroom. I thought it was just a dream, but then I heard the knock again softly, and I was completely awake. Mason's voice woke me up, Mom, even if it wasn't loud. I tried to concentrate on the door by blinking. Mason's outline was visible to me in the weak hallway light. I sat up, attempting to fully awaken. "What's wrong, Mason?" My voice remained sleepy as I posed the question. After a moment, he entered the room and silently shut the door. He appeared uncertain about entering. He stood near my bed, glanced down, and said, "I can't sleep." I was concerned. I could tell he was bothered by something since the divorce. Mason rarely discussed his occasional sleep difficulties. I could feel the anguish in his eyes tonight, and I knew that his father's departure had affected him more than he expressed. I patted the empty spot next to me on the bed and said, "Come here. If you wanted to, you could stay with me tonight." After a brief pause, he approached and lay down next to me. In the low light, I could see how exhausted he appeared as he lay on his side, facing me. "Do you want to talk about it?" He also appeared fragile, which was out of character for him. Gently, I inquired. Mason's brown hair fell over his eyes as he shook his head. "No, all I wanted was to be near you." I felt warm within. Mason hadn't wanted to be this near me in a long time, not since he was younger. Grinning at him, I extended my hand and stroked his hair away from his forehead. He smiled back, but I could still see that he was bothered by something he didn't want to discuss. "That's okay," I whispered, putting my hand on his shoulder. "You can stay as long as you need." I didn't inquire about it. Instead, I reclined, covered us both with the blanket, and allowed the silence to soothe us. For a while, we lay there and relished the tranquility. I assumed Mason had fallen asleep when his breathing slowed, but he spoke again so softly that I could hardly hear him. "Do you ever miss him, Mom?" His inquiry took me aback, but I understood he was referring to his father. I avoided the topic for years because I didn't know how to react. "I do occasionally," I said gently, "but our relationship wasn't going well." He nodded, "As you know, Mason," but I could tell he was curious. "Ever consider how things may have turned out differently?" he inquired. I sighed as I considered my regrets from the past. Indeed, we lack the ability to change the past. We must proceed. Mason fiddled with the blanket's edge while looking down. His remarks broke my heart, and I couldn't help but wonder if I could have done better. I looked to him and sat up. "No, Mason, you weren't to blame." "Really," I said, "you did nothing wrong." I cried and gave him a deep hug as he turned away and muttered, "There are times when I think that maybe Dad wouldn't have left if I had been better." After a moment of resistance, he buried his face in my shoulder and gave me a hug in return. "Listen, Mason," I whispered, trembling. "Your dad made his own decisions. You weren't involved in it. It was never your duty. It was his choice." With love and conviction in my voice, I whispered, "You've always been more than enough for me, Mason." He nodded against my shoulder, but I could still feel the stiffness inside of him, the weight of years of silent agony and guilt. "You are everything to me." The silence between us was a soothing salve as we hugged each other close. His breathing deepened, and his body gradually relaxed as he fell asleep. But although he slept soundly next to me, my mind was racing with memories and ideas that swirled in the dark. Even though we had both been through so much, something unexpected and unidentified sparked inside of me in the quiet solace of our shared embrace. The warmth that permeated my chest was a closer, more personal connection than the typical one between a mother and her son. I made an effort to ignore it in order to concentrate on the cadence of his breathing, but the sensation lingered like a persistent voice that would not go away. The calm light of dawn painted the chamber in delicate hues, but morning came too quickly. Beside me, Mason slept comfortably, his face calm and serene, as if the stress of the night before had vanished. I stared at him for a time, my heart bursting with pride and love. But that strange sensation was a constant undercurrent beneath my maternal love. Careful not to wake him, I crept out of bed and went downstairs to make breakfast. There was a sense of normalcy in the routine of cooking, but my mind kept going back to our late-night chat. Even though Mason had always been sensitive, I was unaware of how much he had internalized his father's absence. The guilt he carried was a burden I wished I could take away, but it wasn't just the guilt that lingered in my mind. It was also the way he had looked at me, the vulnerability in his eyes, the unspoken desire for something more. And if I was being completely honest with myself, the warmth I had felt while holding him had sparked something deep inside of me, a connection that went beyond the confines of our familial roles. I made an effort to ignore the thought by telling myself that he was my son, but the sensation lingered like a persistent whisper that would not go away. Mason soon awoke from his sleep, his hair disheveled, his gaunt body still displaying the signs of adolescence, but his eyes showed a sudden maturity, a glimpse of the man he was growing into. In an attempt to hide the feelings from the previous night, I welcomed him with a welcoming grin. "Good morning, sleepyhead," I murmured, setting a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Good morning," he muttered, sinking into his chair and starting to eat his meal. The kitchen was bathed in a warm glow from the dawn light as we ate in cozy stillness. His eyes lingered on me every now and then, but I refrained from bringing up the subject of the night before. I didn't want to disturb the tenuous tranquility we had established because he appeared more relaxed and like himself. Mason finally broke the silence with a voice full of emotion. "Mom, thank you for last night. That was what I needed." I was surprised by his vulnerability. "Mason, you never need to thank me. No matter what, I'll always be there for you." He gave me a nod, but his eyes were still on me, a question hanging in the air. I was unsure of how to react and handle the slight change in our relationship. A part of me, one that I had not previously dared to admit, felt the new intensity in his eyes, the desire for a connection that went beyond the conventional borders of mother and son. He stayed at the counter after breakfast, making patterns with his fingers. Ever consider how things may have turned out differently? His voice was laden with unsaid emotions as he asked in a low voice. I let out a sigh as I felt the burden of regret from the past. Perhaps, I said quietly, but we are powerless to alter the past. We can only attempt to proceed. Mason looked at his fidgety fingers and nodded. I occasionally questioned whether I could have done things better. His voice, was a mere whisper tinged with self-loathing. His remarks broke my heart, compelling me to reach out to him. I put a hand on his shoulder and pulled him into a soft hug. You did nothing wrong, Mason. With a voice full of emotion, I told him that none of this was your fault. His speech was hardly audible as he turned away. Perhaps I could have prevented Dad's departure if I had performed better. Tears filled my eyes as I drew him in and held him close. After a brief period of resistance, he gave in to the hug and buried his face in my shoulder. Listen to me, Mason, I stated resolutely. Your father made his own decisions. You have always been more than sufficient. You had nothing to do with his departure. He nodded slowly as he sank into the embrace, his body settling against me and the strain in his shoulders gradually releasing. The bond between us, which was previously defined by our roles as mother and son, seemed to be changing and evolving into something new, something neither of us fully understood, but both instinctively felt. I felt that strange warmth rise inside of me once more, a mixture of relief, affection, and an unquestionable sense of connection. I kept him near for the time being, allowing the moment to pass without inquiry or justification. Although I didn't know where our newfound intimacy would lead, I knew this was only the beginning, and that life was changing. I came to a deep understanding as I lay there in the dark, feeling the warmth of my son's embrace. Our relationship was on the verge of something new and unexplored, and its delicate balance was changing. A shudder of fear rushed through me, a murmur of doubt about what this change would bring about for us. But in the midst of the fear, there was an inexplicable sensation of excitement, an understanding that this was only the start of a voyage into the unknown. The delicate rays of sunlight pushed through the curtains as dawn came with a gentle insistency, waking me from my sleep next to Mason. His face was calm and relaxed as he slept soundly, as if the stresses of the night before had vanished. I observed him for a minute, feeling a familiar maternal love swell my heart. But beneath that familiar love, another current swelled, a feeling I couldn't quite pinpoint. It was the same strange feeling that had danced around my consciousness the night before, making me curious and uneasy. Careful not to wake him from his sleep, I slipped. My mind returned to our late-night chat as I stood over the stove, flipping pancakes with a seasoned ease. Although Mason had always been a sensitive person, I was unaware of the extent of his inner turmoil, the shame he carried, the secret he had maintained for too long, and the weight of his father's absence. My heart felt troubled by it now, but it was more than that. There was a change in his manner, a want in the way he had found comfort in my arms. He was seeking a closeness that transcended the traditional boundaries between mother and son. And if I was being completely honest with myself, I had also sensed it, a comfort that went beyond maternal instinct, a warmth that permeated me when I held him. I ignored the idea and concentrated on the task at hand. He's just a boy, I told myself, your son. But the sensation persisted like a persistent whisper that would not go away. I greeted Mason with a warm smile, trying to hide the feelings from the previous night. Mason was finally waking up. I smiled warmly at him, trying to hide the feelings from the previous evening. There was also a newfound maturity in his gaze, a hint of the man he was becoming. I chirped, "Good morning, sleepyhead," and set a plate of golden pancakes in front of him. "Good morning," he murmured as he sat down and started eating his meal with much anticipation. With the kitchen glowing warmly from the morning sun, we ate in cozy stillness. At times, I could feel his gaze on me, but I kept quiet since I wasn't prepared to discuss the intricacies of the revelations from the night before. He appeared more relaxed and more like himself, and I didn't want to disturb the tenuous calm we had managed to establish. At last, he spoke, his tone filled with appreciation. "Mom, thank you for last night." That was what I needed. The fact that he was so vulnerable shocked me. "You never have to thank me, Mason," I told him, "because I'll always be there for you, no matter what." He nodded, but there was a silent query in his eyes that reflected the feelings I had been struggling to express. There was a depth and intensity in his gaze that went beyond the comforting familiarity of our mother-son relationship. The day went by without incident. While I busied myself with housework and Mason with his studies and video games, the atmosphere between us had gradually changed. It was a subtle shift, a silent tension, an implicit recognition of the stronger bond that had developed as the day gave way to night. My mind went back to Mason, to how he had changed from a youngster to a young man, to how close we had been the previous evening. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that my sentiments for him had changed and were no longer limited to maternal love. We sat down to watch a movie on the couch that night after supper. The flashing images on the television created dancing shadows on the walls of the poorly lit room. We were generally quiet, pleased to be together. But as the film went on, I became more conscious of his closeness and the way his arm touched mine with every move he made. And I tried to concentrate on the movie, but the attention between us was evident, a silent symphony of unspoken emotions. He didn't leave this time. His flesh on mine was warm, and it made me shudder with awareness. I looked at him, and our eyes locked. His eyes had a fresh intensity to them, reflecting the feelings I had been repressing all day. I reached out and took his hand without thinking, our fingers entwining. Instead of resisting, he softly squeezed my hand while slowly moving his. As a quiet tribute to the changing dynamics of our relationship, we sat like that for a long time, hands joined in the dim light. The simple action sent a flutter through my heart, a sensation that was both familiar and thrillingly new. It was a pivotal moment, an epiphany that went beyond the confines of our household responsibilities. Although I didn't know the future, I knew things were changing, and Dan was more than my son. As he breathed, I felt his chest rise and fall steadily, while I rested my head on his shoulder on the couch, obliviously watching the credits roll. I rested my head on his shoulder and felt his chest rise and fall steadily as he breathed. Although it was a modest gesture, it felt incredibly personal, like a silent recognition of the bond that was developing between us. Mason said in a scarcely discernible murmur, "Mom, yes, I'm thrilled you're here." His straightforward yet profound remarks mirrored the feelings I was feeling. As I lay there in the darkness, wrapped in the warmth of my son's embrace, I was glad he was here too, glad for this unexpected closeness, this newfound intimacy that was both frightening and exhilarating. A profound realization came to me that the delicate balance of our relationship was shifting, teetering on the precipice of something new and uncharted. A tremor of apprehension ran through me, a whisper of uncertainty about what this transformation might mean for us. But amid the anxiety, there was an unmissable sense of anticipation, a realization that this was just the beginning of a journey into the unknown. Dawn arrived with a gentle insistence, the soft tendrils of sunlight slipping through the curtains, waking me from my sleep. Mason slept soundly next to me, his face calm and relaxed, as if the stresses of the night before had vanished. For a minute, as I observed him, a familiar maternal love swelled my heart. But beneath that familiar love, another current swelled, a feeling I couldn't quite pinpoint. It was the same strange feeling that had danced around my consciousness the night before, making me curious and uneasy. Slipping out of bed, I did. I went downstairs to the regular ritual of making breakfast, being careful not to wake him from his sleep. As I stood at the stove, skillfully flipping pancakes, my thoughts returned to our late-night conversation. Although Mason had always been a sensitive person, I was unaware of the extent of his inner turmoil, the shame he carried, the secret he had maintained for too long, and the weight of his father's absence. My heart felt troubled by it now. But it was more than that. His behavior had changed in the way he had turned to me for comfort, a desire for intimacy that went beyond the conventional lines between mother and son. And if I was being completely honest with myself, I had sensed it too, a comfort that went beyond maternal instinct, a warmth that radiated through me when I held him. I ignored the idea and concentrated on the task at hand. Heck, just a boy, I told myself, your son. But the sensation persisted like a relentless whisper that would not go away. After a while, Mason woke up and wiped the sleep from his eyes. His unkempt hair was a testament to his childhood innocence, but his eyes showed signs of maturity and the man he was growing into. I greeted him with a warm smile, attempting to mask the lingering emotions from the night before. I chirped, "Good morning, sleepyhead," and set a plate of golden pancakes in front of him. "Good morning," he murmured as he sat down and started eating his meal with much anticipation. With the kitchen glowing warmly from the morning sun, we ate in cozy stillness. Sometimes I could feel his gaze on me, but I kept quiet since I wasn't prepared to discuss the intricacies of the disclosures from the night before. He appeared more relaxed and like himself, and I didn't want to disturb the tenuous calm we had managed to establish. At last, he spoke, his tone filled with appreciation. "Mom, thank you for last night." That was what I needed. The fact that he was so vulnerable shocked me. "You never have to thank me, Mason," I told him, "because I'll always be there for you, no matter what." He nodded, but there was a silent query in his eyes that reflected the feelings I had been struggling to express. His eyes had a depth and intensity that went beyond our mother-son bond's comforting familiarity. The day went by without incident. While I busied myself with housework and Mason with his studies and video games, the atmosphere between us had gradually changed. It was a subtle shift, a silent tension, an implicit recognition of the stronger bond that had developed as the day gave way to night. The more I thought about Mason, his transition from boy to young man, and our intimacy, the more I understood that my feelings for him had grown beyond the bounds of maternal love. That night, after dinner, we sat down to watch a movie on the couch. The room was dimly lit, with flickering images on the screen, creating dancing shadows across the walls. We were largely silent and content in each other's company, but as the film went on, I became acutely aware of his proximity, the way his arm brushed against mine. With every slight change, my heart raced, and I tried to concentrate on the film, but the tension between us was evident, a silent symphony of unsaid feelings. Halfway through the movie, Mason shifted closer, his arm pressing against mine. He didn't leave this time. His flesh on mine was warm, and it made me shudder with awareness. I looked at him, and our eyes locked. His eyes had a fresh intensity to them, reflecting the feelings I had been repressing all day. I reached out and took his hand without thinking, our fingers entwining. He didn't fight back. Rather, he softly squeezed my hand, his thumb moving slowly in a circle across my skin. The slight touch caused my heart to race, a familiar yet exhilaratingly new sensation. We sat like that for a while, hands clasped in the dim light. A silent testament to the shifting dynamics of our relationship. It was a pivotal moment, an epiphany that went beyond the confines of our household responsibilities. I had no idea what the future would bring, but I was aware that things were shifting and that Mason was more than simply my son. I cared for him in a manner that was impossible to describe. We stayed on the couch while the credits rolled without seeing the end of the film. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. Although it was a modest gesture, it felt incredibly personal, like a silent recognition of the bond that was developing between us. Mason said in a scarcely discernible murmur, "Mom, yes, I'm thrilled you're here." His straightforward yet profound remarks mirrored the feelings I was feeling. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I felt fully alive, and I was pleased that he was here as well. I was grateful for this unexpected intimacy, this newfound closeness that was both frightening and thrilling. There was only the unmistakable, unadulterated truth of our love, no guilt or misunderstanding. It was a relationship rooted in trust, understanding, and years of shared experiences that went beyond blood. It was a love that seemed as inevitable as the dawn and as natural as breathing. After our shared passion, we lay there in tranquility, broken only by the gentle cadence of our breathing. Mason eventually withdrew, his eyes searching mine with a love that warmed my heart. "Are we all right? Are we all right?" he inquired softly in the shadows. I nodded, speechless for a second, my heart bursting with feelings that words could not express. "Yes," I said in a whisper, my voice full of hidden realities. "We okay?" Later that evening, Mason and I sat on the back porch, relishing the peace and quiet of the night. After clearing away the last of the meal and calming down the house, the air was cool and crisp, and the stars were strewn across the sky like diamonds. For the first time in weeks, I felt as though a weight had lifted from me. We didn't talk much, but it didn't matter. It was enough to be close to him and enjoy the silent beauty of the night. There was only a relaxed quiet that spoke a lot. There was no pressure or sense of haste. This between us, whatever it was developing naturally, and I was pleased to let it. Blossom reached for my hand at his own pace, and the warmth he gave me spread like wildfire. We sat there with our fingers linked and the gentle brightness of the stars shining on us as I grinned and gave him a gentle squeeze on the hand. It was an inexplicable love, a bond that went beyond the confines of our familial responsibilities. And as the days turned into weeks and our intimacy grew, I knew that no matter what obstacles arose, we would face them together under the wide night sky, integrating itself into our everyday routines. It just was. We didn't have to define it with a title. We created a world that was exclusively ours through the way our eyes met, the lingering touches, and the quiet moments we spent together. Our bond became more solid and real with every day that went by. The initial turmoil dissipated, giving way to a sense of righteousness and a sense that I should have been here. Mason had evolved from my son to my boyfriend, companion, and confidant. Our connection had blossomed into something beautiful, fulfilling a longing we were not even conscious of. I didn't fully realize how much we loved each other until a rainy afternoon in late October. With the rain beating steadily against the windows, the sky was a canvas of stormy grays. A fire was blazing in the hearth, illuminating the living room as Mason and I nestled up on the couch. The warmth of the fire and our closeness shielded us from the storm outside, wrapping us in a blanket. I was enjoying the peaceful intimacy of the moment as I ran my fingers through Mason's hair while he was leaning against me and laying his head on my shoulder. The rain-streaked windows obscured the outside world, making us feel alone and in our own small world. He was breathing steadily and slowly, and I could tell without a word that he was experiencing the same change in our relationship, the same irresistible draw towards something deeper. In that instant, the sincerity of our love resonated between us as he raised his head and met my eyes. It was more than just love. It was a connection that went beyond the roles we had traditionally played and had developed into something more profound and indisputable. "Mom," he said, his voice full of emotion. He said, reaching for my hand, "I love you for who you are, not just because you're my mother. It's unclear if this is allowed, but I can't stop it." I waited for him to continue, knowing that whatever he said would change everything. His words carried over me like a warm wave, filling the room with a love that made my heart ache in the most beautiful way. His expression and acknowledgement of the strength of his emotions enhanced their vividness, even though I could feel them. I felt the steady beat of his heart beneath my fingertips as I grasped his palm. "I also love you, Mason," I said in a tremulous tone. "I have always loved you, but this is different." He nodded, looking into my eyes for confirmation, for a response to the question that lingered between us. I have no idea what this implies. I didn't feel wrong about it, but I know that I feel the same way, so I went on. "It feels natural." His lips formed a gentle smile, and I felt a delight I had never experienced before fill my heart. "We'll work this out," I promised him. "I'm glad you feel that way," he muttered, "because I don't know what I'd do if you didn't." I reached up and caressed his cheek, feeling the warmth of his flesh beneath my fingertips. For a minute, we sat there in silence, our eyes fixed on each other, and the only sounds were the soft patter of the rain and the crackle of the fire. No words were needed. We had already expressed everything we needed to. We were both aware of our feelings and that they were genuine and indisputable. Mason drew in slowly, his gaze never leaving mine, and he gave me a tentative, gentle kiss. A gentle, loving kiss released all the love and need we had been suppressing for so long. There was only a genuine manifestation of our intense bond, no hurry or sense of pressure. His eyes were full of emotion as he withdrew, and although I knew we had reached a threshold and there was no turning back, I felt calm instead of dread, convinced that this was our destiny. As the rain kept coming down and the fire illuminated our hug with a warm glow, he drew me in and put his arms around me. I was certain that we would overcome any obstacles together at that precise time. The remainder of the evening was a haze of tender kisses, whispered chatter, and soft touches. The intimacy we shared as the rain resumed its soft melody became the only thing that mattered, leaving me amazed at the rapid transformation of our relationship. We didn't talk about the future or the ramifications of our newfound love. Our relationship had changed from being a boy to a man, and as a result, it had become something unexpected, lovely, and ideal for us. Mason returned to my room that evening, but this time he didn't hesitate. He climbed into the bed next to me and held me tightly with his arms. It was the embrace of lovers, not the reassuring hold of a mother and son, which is equivalent to two spirits entwined. I put my head on his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, a melody of contentment and love. I felt a sense of fullness and serenity that I hadn't recognized I was lacking for years. I was prepared for whatever this was or had turned into. Although Mason and I had always been close, we had evolved into something more that was difficult to describe. We were lovers and partners, two spirits united by a love that went beyond social norms. A smile curved my lips as I fell asleep. I knew it was crazy, but it felt fantastic.